I would argue that we are in a very, very difficult position. The downturn in the economy, which is underway, we see rising unemployment, we see falling job numbers, we see a record office vacancy rate. We have not recovered from the pandemic transformation. It is costing us. If you know how long-term leases in commercial buildings work, you know it takes years to unwind leases that typically run for 5 or 10 years. We are in the early stages of that unwinding process. The role of the dollar in the world is less than what it was 20 years ago, markedly less. I could go on, but to gloss over all of that by saying, well, we're in a strong position, this is maybe good for your digestion, maybe helps you sleep at night, but as economic analysis, not so good.
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Professor Richard Wolff. Richard is a well-known critic of an alternative contemporary economic system, host of Economic Update and founding director of Democracy at Work. So Richard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation because I guess some people would say your opinions are quite radical, and it's really interesting ways to get opinions from different parts of the spectrum. But just because we're focused on economy and finance, I guess from your perspective, what are you currently seeing in US and global economy at the moment?
Well, there are many topics to talk about. We're in the middle of an election campaign. There was already growing interest in light of what happened in Britain and in light of what happened in France. That interest is now becoming more intense. As we have seen before, that is one area that is creating, at the very least, enormous uncertainty, political, economic, cultural, you name it. Perhaps even bigger issue, although slower in terms of its evolution, is the changing world economy. The United States is in a very, very unusual and difficult situation. Unusual in the sense we haven't had anything like it for a century, and difficult because we face, the United States now I'm speaking of, and to some degree this includes Europe as well, the first serious competitor, the People's Republic of China, now with its allies in the BRICS configuration. These are uncharted waters. There is no experience with such a competitor for a very long time. The competition gets more difficult literally with each passing week. There is enormous conflict and division in the United States as to how to cope with this problem, or even whether we can cope with this problem. So we have enormous challenges and uncertainties. And then the underlying reality is that we're a society that has been undergoing a growing gap between rich and poor, unequal distributions of wealth and poverty that get worse with each passing decade for at least now the last 40 years, 1980 to the present. The instability, our business cycles are as bad as ever. We had a crash in 2020, another one in 2008, then another one in 2020, 2000, 2008, 2020. Another one is now coming down the pike. We're in the early stages of it. So the instability and the inequality that have been long-term problems are not getting any better. And so this is a difficult, very difficult period of American economic history. And I only hope that our friends around the world understand that, rather than imagining that the United States is comfortably in the driver's seat globally the way it was for the second half of the 20th century.
Okay, thanks for explaining that. I guess a lot of people would maybe push back and say the United States is the best. It's the best shirt out of the bunch. The economy seems to be growing. As you said, there's lots of inequality globally, but it seems like the U.S. economy is strong. Would you agree with that statement?
No. Basically, I think that's a carefully cultivated process that psychologists would call denial. Yes, if we compare ourselves with some of your countries in Europe and elsewhere, of course. And we do have the legacy of having been the top of the American empire for most of the last century. But in point of fact, we are a smaller player in the world today. I'll just give you one of the many factors that lead me to answer no to your question. The G7, the United States and its major allies, now account for about 29% of global GDP. China and its allies now account for about 33, 34% of global GDP. The numbers are rough, and all these measurements are, but they are revolutionary. The United States and its allies are no longer the player in the world, the dominant, who is so dominant that everybody else is a marginal footnote. That's over. China and its allies are now major players. And I would argue that every country on earth, including the United States, is in a process of trying to figure out how to adjust to this sea change in global economic life. And the United States, for example, the Republican Party, which, if the polls are to be believed, will win the presidential election with Mr. Trump this November. The Republican Party just announced in its document, its platform, that it is going to raise tariffs on everybody in the world, 10%, and then 30% on top of that for the Chinese. That's a very serious thing. I understand platforms are just words, and they're not often governing what actually happens later. But they do give you a good idea of where at least a sizable part of the business community's heads are. They are for decoupling from China. They are for go it alone. They are for a radical realteration of global supply chains and all that implies. I think these are extraordinary decisions made by a major party. If Mr. Trump wins and he does some or all of these things, it is going to affect every business probably in the world in ways that it is difficult to foretell, especially when you understand the interconnections of businesses, so that what one business does to adjust will in turn affect how every other one does it, and so on. I would argue that we are in a very, very difficult position. The downturn in the economy, which is underway, we see rising unemployment, we see falling job numbers, we see a record office vacancy rate. We have not recovered from the pandemic transformation. It is costing us. If you know how long-term leases in commercial buildings work, you know it takes years to unwind leases that typically run for 5 or 10 years. We are in the early stages of that unwinding process. The role of the dollar in the world is less than what it was 20 years ago, markedly less. I could go on, but to gloss over all of that by saying, well, we're in a strong position, this is maybe good for your digestion, maybe helps you sleep at night, but as economic analysis, not so good.
So do you think this is a side effect of maybe not having that power to conflict with? It's been the big fish in the pond that's not having any competition. Now when competition comes up, everyone gets hawkish, everyone gets afraid. They want to go back to where they were, where you're the only one that can do anything.
Yes, I think that's a part of the story, definitely. I would agree with you. I would put it in very similar terms. It's not that there is no way out. It's not that there's no possible future. I'm not predicting anything like that. But I am saying that this system, the United States in particular, has accumulated over the last 75 years, basically since the end of World War II, has lived in a world largely of its own making, whether it's Bretton Woods or the IMF or the World Bank or any of the basic institutional infrastructure of the world economy. It has let other people in when it has been advantageous to do so, whether it's Russia, China, or anybody else. And it has had largely a free ride. And that's over. And that's a very difficult situation. We were not prepared for it. We are not facing it as a nation even now. Every time I make a presentation, which I have been doing all my adult life as a professor of economics here in the United States, I get lots of pushback, not so much by people who disagree, but by people who have not yet understood what's going on in the sense of the larger framework within which they are making their decisions. And as a result, they are making bad decisions. They're making mistakes, not because they aren't clever, they are. And not because they aren't cautious, they are. And not because there aren't business opportunities, there are. But if you are not taking into account a drastically changed and changing framework or context, well, then you're going to make terrible decisions. Let me give you simply one. Russia invades Ukraine, February 2022. Okay, what is the West going to do? Solution. It's going to supply Ukraine with limitless money, limitless weapons, and impose sanctions on Russia. The mother of all sanctions, which in many ways it was. Mistake. Why? Because Russia has somewhere else to go to offset the sanctions. India, China, Brazil, we all know now, 2 years later, what was possible 2 years ago. But that should have surprised no one. That should have amazed no one. That should have been part of the calculations. Right now in Washington, and believe me, I know, it's understood that most of these sanctions failed. They didn't do what they set out to do. The ruble isn't collapsed. Russian GDP is in better shape now than it was last year or the year before. The price cap on oil is an utter dead letter. I could go on, but the list of failures suggests a bigger problem. And I would argue it is not being willing to come to terms with a changed global situation that's getting more changed with each passing day.
Yeah, and I know this is an issue with bureaucracies where people maybe aren't willing to say the truth, and there's this concern that if you sort of give a opposing opinion, you'll be ostracized. And I'm sure you've probably maybe experienced that because you've had very different opinions.
That's very perceptive of you. I believe that's the problem here. For example, in our election race, given the way we organize our politics in the United States, neither the Republicans nor the Democrats want to be in position to have to say anything of the sort I just said. It is not fashionable to recognize problems, no matter how big they are. And if you can't blame your opponent for them, then you pretend they're not there. And it's very hard to blame Mr. Trump for the collapse of the United States in the world economy. And it's pretty much equally difficult to blame Mr. Biden. These are developments that have much deeper roots, have been going on for longer than either of those two folks have been in dominant political positions. They don't want to do it. Well, the same thing could be seen, for example, with the war in Afghanistan. American military leaders knew years and years before the United States withdrew that that was a hopeless, failed effort. The Taliban won that war, and they won it long before the United States left. Eventually, a new administration, Mr. Biden's, pulled the troops finally out because the embarrassment was becoming too grotesque. But the truth of it was, both before Mr. Biden and with Mr. Biden, with Mr. Trump, with Mr. Bush, with Mr. Clinton, they mostly knew. They really did. And Mr. Obama for sure. But they couldn't risk it. Well, we have that in foreign policy with wars, but we also have it domestically now. You can't admit the problem. So once a year, you have your Secretary of Treasury, for example, Ms. Yellen now, give a speech and with heartfelt emotion talk about the problem of growing inequality in the United States and how the people who don't feel part of what's going on can become dangerously resentful, which we see all around us in the United States. She gives the speech. I believe she means it. I was a classmate of hers getting our PhDs together in the university, so I actually know her. So I can assure you she means it, but she can't do anything about it. She hasn't done anything about it, nor have her predecessors of either party. It's as though we're in a slow motion film watching a very bad disaster unfold, but being limited somehow to a kind of semi spectator status. Very unnerving for this society.
Hey everyone, sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to extend a massive thank you to you for listening and tuning in and for your support over these 3 years. So we've had, hundreds of guests that we've welcomed on the podcast. We've had millions of views with hundreds of thousands of different people listening in. So I just wanted to thank you. You know, I started this as a student and now currently working and I've always done this on the side just because I have a passion for it and I've enjoyed it. And probably similar to yourself, you listen to all these, different YouTube channels and podcasts of people listening to different guests. That's how I started, and I just wanted to sort of take the plunge and be able to have the opportunity to speak to these people, and you've made that happen. So thank you very much. Just myself, don't make any money from this, and it's really a passion project. So thanks for supporting that passion of mine. If you wanted to support the channel, all I ask is if you could like, subscribe, or even comment, positive or negative feedback. I'm always willing to take constructive criticism. I'd really appreciate that. But otherwise, thanks so much. If you can believe it, only 14% of our listeners actually subscribe to the podcast. So if you can, great. If not, no problem at all. Thanks for listening. And let's get back to the show. Yeah, it's like a slow motion car crash, which you can't do anything to do, unfortunately. So you mentioned at the start that a lot of this inequality, and I guess, if you look at maybe the issues started around the 1980s, that's when, this occurred. So I guess from your perspective, what were the major causes, and I guess what amplified that over the last 40 years?
Yes, that's a great question. The basic problem was, for the United States, a classic capitalist problem, namely profitability declining long-term. Things had looked so good in the aftermath of the end of World War II. Remember, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, China, none of those potential competitors, if they really were such, were in a position to compete with the United States. They had all been devastated literally by the war or indirectly by the effects of the war. The United States, by contrast, other than the Pearl Harbor event, had no bombs fall on it, lost relatively many fewer people to the war, and basically emerged from a Great Depression, the 1930s, by virtue of putting half of our unemployed people into uniform and the other half of them producing the guns and bullets and so forth that the uniformed folks needed for the war. So when the war is over, the world is our oyster. Every other imperial country, Britain, France, all the others, lose their colonies if they haven't already lost them. And the United States fills the vacuum, to make a complex and long story short. And it puts us in this incredible kind of position. We can afford, for example, to give our workers 5% real income increases every year with wages. The inflation is held back. You're able to reproduce for the whole world. The Marshall Plan allows you to sell goods to Europeans to rebuild in their society, and so on and on. All of that by the 1970s and 80s, that wave of rebuilding and of taking over the world economy and making it the American empire is done. And so now you have a bit of a crisis, well known in the 1970s, and they have to find solutions, and they do. And that's what we are living with now. The solution number one, tremendous focus on technical change that is economizing on labor. And whether you want to point to the computer or to robotics or to artificial intelligence or to atomic energy. I mean, there's an endless array of technical changes that are very advantageous to capital and much less so to labor. Number two, you move out of the United States. The jet engine and the internet provide you with the ability to be as directly on top of situation with a factory in China or Brazil or Nigeria as you used to be with one in New Jersey or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. And Americans discover quickly, as do Europeans and Japanese, that they can find well qualified, well educated, well disciplined labor forces at a tiny fraction of the wages, and with the whole thing brokered by governments desperate for what they call economic development and willing to provide all the infrastructure, all of the tax holidays that could be imagined. And so you have this extraordinary explosion, which we rechristen neoliberal globalization, but it's really another phase of capitalism maximizing its profits, offsetting the decline of that good time after World War II. So now we have global dispersion, we have technological change, and then the last of the three, increased mobility of poor people leaving countries of low wages and coming to work in the metropolitan countries in huge numbers, often taking the poorest jobs, the lowest paid jobs, allowing the native, if you like, working class, a kind of a temporary holiday of not being at the bottom of the totem pole, being above that, having the immigrants replace them. Yes, there are problems. We see them more and more. But the bottom line was a really good period of capitalism, record profits, booms in our stock markets, but the accompaniment, a growing gap between the top 10 to 15% who could participate in all of that through the stock markets, but a mass of people whose jobs in manufacturing in the United States and in Western Europe disappeared, and who did not find comparable jobs under comparable circumstances, at least not in the United States. And that is shaping and shaking our politics now, because that can't go on. Neoliberal globalization has produced such a pushback, such a reaction, that the American working class, for the first time in a century, seriously considers voting for Republicans out of an anger and a rage against the Democrats for not only having not improved their situation over the last 50 years, but actually having been unable to protect what had been achieved under Franklin Roosevelt and in the early years into the 50s and 60s. So it is a watershed moment in American politics where everything is shifting. If I could use a metaphor, the surprise that so many seem to have felt at the results of the election in France just completed should not have surprised people. These kinds of shiftings are going on everywhere. They are certainly going on in the United States. And we are watching the emergence. Here it has to be an emergence because the left was destroyed here after World War II in a way that did not happen in Europe. And so they are going to handle it differently. But very similar basic tectonic shifts are underway here as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess if we look at France, more than 60% of people voted for extreme, either left or right candidates. So it's seems to be the way it's going. Would you say that, I guess, what we've seen with the globalization is that wealth has been distributed not just over 300 million or, let's say 600 million when you include Europe, but it's been distributed, over billions. Is that what's really happened? And it's the fact that, the people who, the 1% have benefited because they're getting the benefit from the globe, and the average worker has gone down because they're competing against workers internationally. Is that sort of what's happened?
Yes, that's a large part of what's happened. If I were to be teaching an elementary economics course, as I sometimes do, I'd do my supply and demand on the blackboard, and I'd show that by bringing China, India into the world economy, and I don't mean to pick just those two, but they're the two big populations in the world, you're bringing a massive increase in the supply of labor power with no comparable increase in the demand for it. And that is going one way or another, the way markets work. That's going to show up in a decline, not everywhere, not equally, but a decline in what labor can get out of the market in which it functions. And it's going to advantage capitalism because of this great new supply of labor. Now, all kinds of things are being done about that, but it is also a situation in which the vast majority of the people of the world understand that they are getting the short end of this stick when it comes to wealth, and they are not accepting it, and they are producing leaderships and movements and documents and demands that are pressing up against a received division of labor that comes out of previous centuries, and that is going to be contested and changed now. And I would argue that the wisdom of the human race is it's better to understand it, work with it, try to come to a livable arrangement around it, rather than holding up your hands with the imaginary notion that you can stop this process, that people will forever accept that 10% of the world consumes 50 to 60% of the output of the world. This is not going to, this is over. And the sooner we understand it, the better our chance to work through it in a peaceful way, because we live in a world of nuclear weapons. And, there is always the horror of imagining where that could lead people.
Yeah, and I think that's an exacerbation that a lot of people are having, that, their concerns and I get being ignored, and is saying, you're spending too much, you're doing this, you're doing that. It's not an actual real issues. And I think that's something that, it seems like there's going to be upheaval. So I guess from your perspective, how do you see, if things keep going the way they are, how do you see that ending up? And then what do you think should actually happen?
Well, my suspicion is that there is a growing, let me put it this way, a growing unwillingness to wait much longer. I think what you're seeing is the turning of the American electorate away from center left, center right, rejecting the Bush family and going for Trump, rejecting now Mr. Biden and looking for somebody. Yes, we talk about age problems and cognitive ability, but these are details. The problem is, and you could see it in Britain and you could see it in France, the sitting government is held accountable for a deteriorating situation. And so there's less and less patience with it. There's a growing desire to try something, anything else but the existing run-of-the-mill, middle-of-the-road. They're just not going to go for it. But they have no patience if the new, the different. I'm going to borrow, if you allow me, from Britain. If you have a tousle-haired prime minister who tells you that Brexit will solve our problems, yeah, you're dubious, you're skeptical, but the people who are the reasonable ones who you've been relying on are no longer tolerable. So you'll give him a chance. It turns out it doesn't work. Okay, now you're going to give Starmer a chance. The French don't want Mr. Macron. He was the bright young man a few years ago. His poll numbers are worse than Biden's, which is extraordinary. But the French don't want that anymore. They'll try extreme on the left and they'll try extreme on the right. But it's not so much that they want the left or they want the right, but they know that that center has failed them. And if I were their advisor, I would say it's really not the center's fault either. You're part of a larger process. What you have the right to say to all of them, center, left, and right, do you have a plan for how to deal with the realities? The problem in these societies is they don't know what the realities are. And that's partly a problem of the media, which are holding back from confronting people with the reality. Look, we all know it's much easier to go up the hill with a rising empire than to go down the hill with a declining one. But since every empire the human race has ever had has its up and its down, the United States was bound sooner or later to have its down, having had its up. That's where we are, and that has to be faced. If that were put front and center, you would perhaps force the left or the right or the center to actually attend to those issues and come up with a plan. So far, my fear is none of them have done it. Each of them, in their different way, are coming up with rehashed versions of what they've always said. And here in the United States, it reaches ridiculous levels. We have a country of 330 million people, one of the richest in the world. We are faced with a population of undocumented immigrants numbering maybe 10 million, maybe, if you want to be exaggerated, 15 million. The economic conditions of 330 million Americans is not being determined by the 10 million or 15 million of among the poorest people on earth. That's crazy. That's pure scapegoatism. But when reasonable people get all excited about it, which is what we have here in the United States, you realize that something very important is being displaced from what it really is to this immigration issue. And there are 10 others I could point to as well. And that's a sign of a society not yet willing to deal with the real problems it has, which is at least part of the explanation why left, right, and center have not yet come up with real plans that the mass of people could then choose among.
Yeah, you touched on some great points. For example, Tories failed. If Labour come in and fail themselves, then that's going to, I guess, lead to extremists like Reform and Greens and other parties. And I think another thing as well is it doesn't seem to be a left or right. It's just the people who are in power and during the inflation and all these challenges versus, the people who weren't. So basically, people are just trying to get rid of everyone who they blame for those issues, even though they might have been global. But yeah, Richard, I know we're sort of coming up on time, so thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. My last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Face the realities of a changing world economy. Whatever you think of the People's Republic of China, put it aside for a minute. Try to understand what they have accomplished, what they are doing, and how it changes the world economy. So maybe we can come to a live and let live accommodation. The way the British accommodated the rise of the American empire might even be a model, if I could be so bold. But it should be something other than the pretending and the hostilities that are now the form that you get closest to recognizing this problem.
Okay, great message. So, yep, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best places for that be?
Easiest thing, democracyatwork.info. The internet, go there. Everything we do is there.
Perfect. I'll put that in the description below, but thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment, good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that, but it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right. Thanks again.